Do you remember this cute little top that I made, I don't know, a few weeks ago? Well, I thought it was time to remake it in a fabric I'm actually going to enjoy wearing, because although I love the color in this fabric, all of these lurex little bits are very annoying. So I'm never going to wear this. It's time to make it again. And I thought it'd be fun to film the process, because when I made it the first time, I couldn't really find any sew-alongs for it on the internet, so why not make my own? Hi, if you're new here, I'm Izzy, and my channel is all about sewing garments, quilts, and bags. And in today's video, we are going to sew Butterick 6814, which I've made before because I have a video on the channel showing you how I use the Nancy Zeman method to make this top fit me. It was a great success. It fits like a charm, but like I said, the fabric is preventing me from wearing it. So now's the time to make it in a fabric I'm going to enjoy wearing, and I'm taking you along with me. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole cutting out process. I showed you how to adjust the pattern. You probably know how to cut fabric. So all of my pieces are piled here, ready to sew. So I'm going to take the instructions and follow them to make a new version of this top. But I'll let you know what changes I'm making, and there are very few changes. Really, it's just the flounce at the neckline that I've decided to change. So I'll let you know what I'm doing instead. So let's jump right in, pull out our instructions, and get going. All right, so I've got my instructions, but before we start sewing, the first thing we're going to do is take every piece that has a curve, such as this flounce, and we are going to stay stitch all around at about 1/4 inch. So the flounce pieces. Now, one thing I forgot to say that I probably should have said, I cut 4 of these pieces because we are going to double up our flounce instead of just finishing the bottom, so that you can't see the white underside of the fabric when there's movement or wind or whatever. So cut 4 of these, stay stitch the inside curve over here like this at about 1/4 inch. You're going to do the same thing for the back arm size and neck. And you're going to do the same thing to the front as well, the arm side and the neck edges. So once that's done, step number 1 is to fuse the interfacing to the facing, which I have done right here. So both pieces are interfaced. And next we're going to sew our darts. So here's my front piece. I used a friction pen to mark. Hopefully you can see that. I marked my darts. So basically, you just put the dart legs together, right sides together, and then pin everything on your marked line. And then you're going to sew the dart starting at the side seam all the way to the end of your dart. And then you're going to press those downward, if you have one on a tailor's ham, to make them nice and curvy. So I'm going to go ahead and sew both of my darts on the front piece, press them down, and then we'll continue. All right, so I've got my darts on the front, all sewn. There we go. Now the next step in the instructions say stitch the front and back together at the shoulders. So you're going to take your front piece and the back piece. If I can find my back piece. So many flounces. There we go. All right. So I've got the back piece over here. So we're going to join the front and the back at the shoulders, right sides together. So just like this. Now I like to pin. Takes a second more, but it makes sure that everything stays aligned properly. Especially, this is a lightweight rayon twill, and it's only like 125 GSM. It's pretty lightweight. Tends to shift and stuff, so yeah, I put one pin at the beginning of the seam, another pin at the end, and then one in the middle. That way everything stays nice and aligned. I'm gonna pin both shoulders before I stitch them down, just faster that way. So there's a notch on that seam, so we're gonna match up the notch and then put another pin at the end and one in the middle. All right, the seam allowance for this is 5/8 of an inch. So I'm gonna go ahead and sew this at 5/8, back stitching at the beginning and the end. Make sure you're letting the feed dogs, especially if you're sewing with a lightweight fabric like I am, like don't pull, just let the feed dogs do their thing. Alright, and after you sew your two seams, you need to finish them however you want to finish them. So pinking shears, zigzag stitch, I'm just going to go ahead and use my serger. So I'm going to go ahead and finish my seams, and then I'll come back here for the next step. Alright, so we're going to set the bodice aside for now. We've sewn our shoulders, finished the seams, and pressed them to the back. Next, we're going to deal with our flounce. So you're going to take two of your pieces, and we're going to sew the center front seam. So the center front seam has one notch. There you go. And the center back seam on the flounce has two notches. So you're going to take one piece and then another piece, and right side together, you're going to match up your front or center front, matching up your notch. Okay, so I've got both my pieces aligned right sides together. And starting 5/8 of an inch away from the inner part of the flounce. So you've got your flounce like this now. We're pinning this side, which is the center front. So you're going to start sewing 1/8, so a seam allowance away from. You're going to start there. There should be a dot on the pattern piece that you should have marked. So you're going to start sewing there all the way down, back stitching. You don't need to finish this seam. And you're going to do the exact same thing to the other set of flounces that you cut so that we can fully line this flounce. So go ahead and pin it together, and then starting 5/8 of an inch from the top, sew all the way down, back stitch. Do the same thing for your second set of flounce pieces. Oh, and once you've done that, press your seam open and then sew the center back seam the same way, except that this one you sew the whole thing. No need to start at 5/8 of an inch. All right, so now we've got 2 circles, 2 very floppy circles. So now we're going to stitch them together on the outside. So on the, when you're looking at it right side up, we're going to sew around the outside edge. So we're going to put them right side to right side. Make sure you're pinning the back seam to the back seam. So basically I've got the back seam here, I've got both pieces, and I'm going to pin them on the outside edge. So pinning the back seam first and then going to the center seam or center front seam, and again putting my seams together, pinning that, and then go around pinning every few inches or so, and then once you're done pinning all around, you're going to stitch both of those together at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So finish pinning all around, sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then come back. We'll trim our seam allowance to about 1/8, so about by half, and then we're going to turn it right side out and press it so that it's ready to attach to our neckline. So go do all of those steps, pin, sew at a 1/4 inch, trim your seam allowance by half, and then press it or turn it outside, inside out, or right side out. And then press it so it's ready to attach to our neckline. All right, so here's our pretty flounce, all pressed. There we go. This is what it looks like. So now, even if the wind blows or I move, all you'll see is the right side of the fabric, which is very nice. Okay, so now the next step is we need to pin this flounce to the neckline of our bodice. So right sides, okay, well hold on, let me see. With right sides up, pin the flounce to neck edge of top, matching centers and symbols, clipping the flounce where necessary. All right, so we are going to have the right side of our bodice. All right, so we've got the right side, and now we're going to pin the flounce with the right side of our flounce up. Now, it doesn't really matter what the right side is. I mean, depending on your fabric, you may have, you know, some print placements or something that you would rather see be the right side. It's up to you. I actually noticed that I cut my piece a little too close to the selvage, and I've got a little bit of the selvage showing up on one side. So I'm going to make sure that's the back side of my flounce. All right, so starting at the center back, so there's a notch on your center back, and then you've got the seam of your flounce, on the center back, so you're going to match that up. and put a pin. Now try and make sure that the two layers of your flounce stay together so they get pinned along the neckline. Once you've pinned the back seam, we're going to do the same thing for the front at the V. And then we're going to go around the entire neckline. And because you stay stitched all of the rounded edges, everything should line up perfectly. There should not be any easing of anything. Everything's going to match perfectly. So once you've pinned the flounce to your bodice, you're going to stitch it. Hold on. Oh, you're going to baste it first. So basting means you're basically going to stitch it with a longer stitch length at about a 1/4 inch so it stays within the seam allowance. Because after we've done that, the next step will be to sew our facing onto the neckline. So go ahead and pin your neckline nice and even all around. Baste it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then meet me back there and we will tackle the facing. All right, well, it is obviously on a different day, but we are back, and now we've sewn our flounce to the blouse. There it is, front and back. So it is actually basted in place at our 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now we're going to set this aside for a minute, and we are going to put together our facing. So grab your front facing, which is this here, and your back facing, which is this here. Both pieces should be interfaced, and you're going to put them right sides together at the shoulders so that you'll have something that looks like this. So you've got the two facings right sides together, pinned at the shoulders, and you're going to sew them at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure you match the notches because you shouldn't be lining the ends of each pieces exactly. So, like for example, you have a little bit here. So that basically what you're lining up is the sewing line over here and not lining up the edges over here. So if you line up your notches, then that should work out perfectly. So I'm going to line up both shoulders and go ahead and sew both of them at once. And then we are going to press those seams open. No need to finish those because they're going to be enclosed. So just go ahead and sew those at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Back stitching at the start and end. All right, so I've got both my seams sewn. So now I'm going to go to the pressing station and press these open, and then come back here and we'll pin that onto our bodice. All right, so the next step now is going to be to pin this facing that's now sewn together to the bodice. But before we do that, we need to finish the outside edge. So the outside edge over here, either by folding it over by a 1/4 inch or by serging it, or by pinking shearing it. I'm gonna go over to the serger, finish the entire outside edge, so you do the same. And then when we come back, I'm gonna show you how to pin this onto the bodice and then sew it on. All right, so we've got the bodice, okay? This is right side up, and you've got the center front right here. And then you've got the facing with the center front right here, and you're gonna put that face down, so right side to right side on the bodice, and you're gonna make sure that the flounce is basically pinned between the bodice and the facing. So I've got the bodice here, so I'm looking at the center front, so you've got the facing right here, right side down, you've got the flounce, and you've got the bodice. All right, and then you're gonna go around pinning the facing to the flounce and bodice, making sure that the center front markings match very, very well. All right, and then pin it all around. And once you're done pinning it, making sure you're matching notches and seam lines, then you're gonna sew it at a 5/8 seam allowance. Trim your seam allowance at least by half, and then understitch, and I'll show you what that means as soon as we've sewn this on. So pin it, sew it on at 5/8 of an inch, trim your seam allowance at least by half, and then meet me back here and we will understitch this. All right, so I've got my facing sewn onto the bodice. I have trimmed my seam allowance by about half. Now I'm going to flip the facing, and making sure that the seam allowance is towards the facing, I'm going to stitch on top of the facing right here about 1/8 away from the seam line on the facing side, making sure I'm catching the seam allowance underneath. So I'm going to put, and this is before you even press it. You're not going to be able to go all the way to the V in the front, but go as far as you can and then skip over the V in the front and then continue on the other side. All right, so I've got the facing here. My seam allowance is on this side, and this is my flounce and bodice. So I'm going to put my needle in about 1/8 away from the seam, and I'm going to stitch all the way around. And this is what we call understitching. And once I've done that, I'm going to go to my pressing station, press the facing to the inside, press everything nice and flat, and then we'll come back here for the next step. All right, so here we go. I've got my facing in, and what I ended up doing, because I despise facings that flop out, I stitched it down a little bit, and because we have the flounce here, you're never going to see it. The stitching is under the flounce, but it's not the prettiest thing in the world on the inside, but well worth it for me because I really don't love facings. So there you go. We've got our flounce on, we've got the facing on. If you want to put in a label, by the way, you can put your label in before you sew your facing down. I completely forgot to put mine in. But yeah, just sew it onto the facing here. Not sewing through everything, but just through your facing, and then you can sew your facing down. If your facing doesn't want to come out at all, you can just hand tack it at the shoulders and at the V, and that way it won't come out. But mine looked like it was just gonna come out everywhere, even though I trimmed my seam allowance understitch. It just, yeah, it wants to flop out. All right, so now our next step is to do our side seams. So you are going to put your bodice so that the outside or the inside is out. And you're gonna line up your side seams here, right sides together, pin them all the way down on both sides, sew them at 5/8 of an inch, then finish your seam, and then come back here so that we can put our sleeves in. All right, so now we are doing the sleeves. The first thing we have to do is put some gathering stitches at the sleeve, at the top of the sleeve. So between the small circles, I put in notches, but between here, this is the top of the sleeve. So between here and here, we are gonna put 2 rows of stitches, of gathering stitches. So basically on your machine, you have to make sure that you're at the longest stitch and that you're keeping some pretty long tails so that you can pull on the thread to gather the fabric a little bit. Like there's not supposed to be a lot of gathering there, but it's just gonna make it easy to ease in the sleeve into the armhole. Now I cheat a little bit when I do this if there's not a lot of gathering to be done, and I only do 1 row of stitches. Now if you want to follow the instructions to the letter, go ahead, do your 2 rows. I'm going to do 1 row at 1/4 inch, and then we're going to sew the seam here to close the sleeve, basically like this. So you're going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch, and then finish your seam here, and then we're going to install it on the bodice. So put in your gathering stitches, making sure you use a very long stitch length, leave some long tails so we can pull on them, and then sew the underarm seam, and then come back here. All right, so now we're going to take our bodice inside out like this, and then pick an armhole, any armhole, and then put the right sleeve into it. So you're going to match the underarm sleeve or the underarm seam to the side seam in the bodice. Now, the trick to knowing which sleeve goes on what side is you need to be able to match your single and double notches on the sleeve with the single and double notch on the bodice. And you're going to do this right sides together. So make sure your sleeve is the right side out, and then match the underarm seam with the side seam like this. Put a pin in there. And then you should be able to match the single notch on the sleeve with the single notch on the bodice. And then same thing on the other side with the double notch on the sleeve and on the bodice. So pin that all around, and actually pin at the notches. Let's do it this way. We're going to pin at the notches. Then pin at the shoulder seam. So you should have marked a big circle at the top of your sleeve. So match that up with the shoulder seam of the bodice. So now we've got a pin here at the shoulders and pins at the notches. And you'll see that the sleeve is a little bit too big for the armhole. So that's what the basting stitches were, or the gathering stitches were all about. So take your thread that's dangling and then pull on it gently just to gather a little bit. You don't need to do a whole lot because there's really not a lot of easing to do here. But just do it until basically your sleeve matches the armhole. And then pin everything together. And do that on both sides of the shoulder, so the front and the back. And then once you're happy that everything fits nicely together, stitch the sleeve onto your bodice. Add a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Do that for both sleeves. Make sure you finish your seam either at the serger or with a zigzag stitch. And then we will almost be done. Now, because the sleeve is bigger than the armhole and you're needing to ease that in, when you sew the sleeve onto the bodice, try to sew with your sleeve onto the bed of your machine. That way the feed dogs will feed everything evenly. Just keep an eye on your gathers at the top to make sure that you don't get any puckers or anything flipping the wrong way or whatever. So just with your fingers, make sure everything stays in place as you're stitching it. All right, so I'm going to keep pinning my sleeve onto the bodice and then stitch it down, finish my seam, and then we will have only a couple of steps left, basically hemming the sleeves and hemming our shirt. Now, I am not putting on any flounces. Where's my pattern? There we go. So all of the different views all have either flounces or frills at the end of the sleeve. I don't want that. I'm not putting that on mine, but if you are, you'll need to follow the instructions to put those on. And you can also do, if you're doing a flounce at the sleeves, you can do like what we did at the neckline and double them up. I didn't mention that at the start because I was never going to put any flounces on my sleeves. I'm just going to hem it as a short sleeves because this is going to be basically a spring-summer top for me. So yeah, make sure you follow the instructions in the pattern to put your flounce on there. And then once that's done, you can finish off your sleeve and join me back here to hem everything. All right, so here we go. Cute little sleeve in on both sides. Now, I haven't pressed mine yet, but I will do that at the end. So now all that's left is hemming the sleeves and the bottom of your shirt. So what I like to do is stitch a guiding stitch, if you will, at the bottom, 1/4 inch. And then when I go to my pressing station, I just follow that stitch for folding it to the wrong side. So I'm going to stitch a guiding stitch on both sleeves at 1/4 inch and at the bottom edge of my shirt. And then we are going to fold up 1/4 inch on that stitching line and then fold up again. I think I'm going to do 3/4 of an inch on the sleeves and on the bottom of the shirt just to keep it simple. So that'll be like a full inch total. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So stitch at 1/4 inch around both sleeves and around the bottom hem of the shirt. And then you're going to press following that stitch and then press again at 3/4 of an inch and then stitch everything down and you'll be done. So I'm going to go ahead and hem everything and then I'll put it on for you and show you what it looks like. There we go. I'm all done. I am wearing it. I'm just going to back up a little so you can see it better. Now ignore the orange pants. There we go. Now it just needs a really good press. Just let me sit down. So it needs a good press. The sleeves are a little poofy. Also, oh no, it's the flounce. I'm like, what is going on this? Yeah. So yeah, besides giving it a good press, this one is all done. And are you crooked? What is happening? There we go. And I'm pretty pleased with this. I think it'll be super cute to go to the office with trousers. Like I'm thinking navy trousers would be super cute with this. Navy cardigan. Yeah, I really like it. And hopefully, if you're making Butterick 6814, this little sew with me was useful. Hi, Bear. Hi, baby. So let me know if you have any questions. Please put those in the comments box below. And yeah, thank you for watching. And if you're curious about how I got this to fit, I made a size 18 and managed to get this to fit me with the Nancy Ziemann pivot and slide method. So if you're curious about that, you can go ahead and go watch this video here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.